Hi everybody. For today, our lecture is going to be focusing on blood vessels. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we're looking at blood vessels, there are three main categories of blood vessels. We have something called the arteries, capillaries, and the last group is referred to as veins. So we are going to start by looking at the arteries and the branching of the arteries as it expands throughout the body. But let's define arteries to start with. So if you take your heart, if we take any blood that is leaving the heart and moving away from the heart is identified as arteries. A lot of people have this misconception that if the blood vessels are carrying red blood, quote unquote, that means that's an artery, and if it's carrying a blue color blood under the skin, that's identified as vein. Though it is true for majority of the blood vessels that a statement is correct, that cannot be true for every blood vessels, as you will learn when we discuss heart anatomy and its blood vessels. So for today, from this point on, if you think about arteries, understand them that there are blood vessels that are basically moving away from the heart, carrying blood away from the heart. And if blood vessels are moving back toward the heart, carrying blood toward the heart, they are identified as veins. Now, between arteries and veins, we have this category of blood vessels called the capillaries or capillary network. These are the smallest of the blood vessels, and they have a single layer of flattened cells that form the wall of these structures or these capillaries, and they are the site for the exchange of molecules between your blood and tissue. So if you take a look at the picture we have down here, what you have on the left-hand side, you have right here, you have your arteries. Arteries, as you can see, it's branching continuously until you get to your capillary network. And you see that the capillary network is made up of single layers of flattened cells called endothelial cells. And then eventually those branches are going to merge together to form your blood vessels that are returning blood back to the heart as veins. Here is a demonstration of histology of the blood vessels. You will notice that in the case of arteries, the diameter are typically smaller. So where the blood passes through is smaller compared to the diameter where blood passes through for veins is much larger. The area that blood passes through is known as lumen. So basically lumen of artery is smaller than the lumen of the vein. Another main differences that are observed is the thickness of the smooth muscle that surrounds the typical artery. In arteries, we have typically a thicker muscle layer when it's compared to veins. So as I mentioned, let's go ahead and take a look at blood vessels and the categories and subcategories for these three main blood vessel types. To do so, we are going to look a little bit more detail about the histology of the blood vessels by looking at the three main layers that forms up the blood vessel wall. These three layers are known as tunica intima. As the word intima should imply for you, these are the deepest layer, like basically very intimate. They're inside, and they're composed of a simple squamous endothelium, which basically means a single layer of flattened cells. The second layer of the blood vessels is referred as tunica media. Kind of think about middle, media. This layer typically contains a smooth muscle at different thicknesses. And a major function associated with them is vasoconstriction, basically means blood vessels constricting, getting smaller in their diameter, or vasodilation, which causes the relaxation of these smooth muscles, opening up the blood vessels. Lastly, what we have is tunica externa. Again, as the name implies, externa means outside. So this layer is composed of connective tissue that is wrapped around the whole blood vessels and basically securing the blood vessels. As I mentioned, if you think about blood vessel, if you cut a cross-section around the cross-section of your blood vessel, the central space where the blood passes through is referred to as lumen. So this is basically the space you see in the middle where blood passes through. Now let's again go ahead and take a look at the distribution of arteries and their subclassification. So the first major blood vessels that it starts from the heart, these are the largest of the blood vessels, are referred to as the elastic arteries. As it says, these are the largest of the arteries. They can be as large as 1 inch, which is about 2.5 centimeters. The blood vessels in this category include basically aorta that starts from the left side of the heart, that's going to supply blood to the rest of the body, and the major branches are coming off of the aorta. Notice that a key or a main difference, as we will notice, between this type of blood vessels and any other ones that are mentioned is high level of elastin, which are basically elastic fibers that are present inside the wall of the elastic arteries. So notice from over here to over here, this space all the way will be identified as elastin, which means that the elastic arteries have the ability to recoil as the blood is moved through them or when there's limited pressure to it. This is extremely important for your body to maintain blood pressure in between each heartbeat, as we will learn and we discuss this later on in the case of heart and its associated blood vessels. You can see still tunica externa, the connective tissue we mentioned, and then the innermost layer, which basically known as the tunica intima, and this is where the blood will be passing through. Notice that this type of arteries do not have a smooth muscle as part of their tissue. Now, as we start to branch farther away from the heart, basically think about arteries that you have, elastic arteries that you have these really large blood vessels, but as these blood vessels or pipelines are spreading throughout your body, they need to form a smaller and smaller branches. So the next category of blood vessels that we have are referred to as muscular or distributing arteries. Basically, they're going to distribute blood throughout the body. Now, notice that there is a significant change in the diameter of these blood vessels. They can be as large as 1 centimeter, which is technically not as big as what we consider for elastic arteries, but they also get relatively small, about 0.3 millimeters. I'm trying again, relatively small considering or when compared to aorta. So these type of blood vessels, as you can notice, the name muscular implies they're going to have a more significant amount of a smooth muscle, not skeletal muscles, a significant amount of a smooth muscle present, and they don't have the elasticity that was observed in the elastic arteries. The other thing that is very visible is a very thick tunica externa, so a lot of a lot of connective tissue, and here what you see is basically muscular tissue, and this thin layer in between them, that would be your elastic membrane. So again, compared to what we saw, the amount of elastic fiber, which is ability to recoil, are significantly decreased. It is replaced with a smooth muscle. Now again, as we continue branching, now we reach arterioles. So we had elastic artery, we had distributing artery or muscular arteries, and now we're down to arterioles. Now, arterioles are very fascinating in a sense that you can actually control the diameter of these blood vessels using local factors within the tissue itself, such as presence of platelets or blood clotting factors, as well as control through the sympathetic nervous system based on the fight or flight response when you need to deal with a stressful situation versus when you're relaxed and you're basically in something called a food coma or rest and digest phase where you don't really need to have your blood vessels to your muscles to be really dilated to send a lot of blood to your muscles. So the key point that I want you guys to understand for arterioles is the diameter of the arterioles actually changes depending on the requirement for the tissue and depending on the environment or the condition your body has been placed in. The other thing you need to notice is a significant, again, decline in the diameter of these blood vessels. So you went from millimeters, which is something that is still visible to you, to a relatively smaller size in about 10 micrometers. So for these blood vessels, you definitely need microscopes if you want to be able to observe them if they are in the lower range of the diameter. Now, they, similar to what we discussed, they will contain all three layers or tunics, but the muscular layer would be a more pronounced layer for the tissue, as you're seeing, observing right here. So we went through elastic artery, distributing / muscular arteries, and then arterioles. Now, arterioles eventually work their way to the last category, or not the last category. They work their way to really, really small blood vessels called the capillaries. So there is a description, or sorry, there's a picture of capillaries right here. You can see these tiny, these red circles as your red blood cells. And if you guys remember from our previous lecture, we mentioned capillaries are basically a single lane road that only allow one cell to pass through, and these cells are your red blood cells. So their diameter is relatively small, about 8 to 10 microns. Again, red blood cells are passing one at a time. Depending on their location, they actually carry different functions. So for instance, when you think about your lung tissue, where the gas exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place, having these capillary networks allows the oxygen to enter the blood from your lungs, and then carbon dioxide to be removed and eventually be exhaled out. In a small intestine, which is the site for absorption, you can receive the digested nutrients into your bloodstream, so basically absorption. In the case of your endocrine glands, these capillaries have the ability to pick up hormones that are being secreted by the endocrine glands, transfer them to the blood, and send them to their final destination. And lastly, if these capillary networks are found in kidneys, one of the functions they do is they remove nitrogenous waste, which we previously identified as either uric acid or urea, the two main metabolic wastes that are produced by your cells. Do understand that every capillary network throughout your body still has the ability to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide, and also has the ability to move ions and nutrients from the bloodstream into the cells for their second-to-second consumption. Now, again, when we're talking about capillaries, capillary beds are basically a network of capillaries that are present in all the tissues in the body, with the exception of your skin and a couple of other locations such as cartilage. But typically when we say capillary beds, every single tissue in your body, with certain exceptions, have access to these capillary beds so they can get their nutrients and remove their waste. Now, what you have inside the capillary beds is something called precapillary sphincters. Sphincters are a smooth muscle, round smooth muscles that basically can constrict or dilate to control blood flow, in this case, to certain regions and body tissues. You also have something called meta-arteriole that runs inside the capillary bed, and it's intermediate between arteriole, which is the blood vessel, and the capillary network that we are discussing right now. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. I just want to clarify this point. So in this picture, we can look at some of the labeling and identify some of the components. So right here, this is a typical arteriole that we have, relatively small in diameter. Now, as you can see, arteriole is being branched to this central line that runs in the middle called the meta-arteriole. And meta-arteriole is surrounded with these network of blood vessels, which we refer to them as capillaries. Now, what you notice is when meta-arteriole is separating to form the capillaries, you have these circular muscles right here that are referred to as precapillary sphincters, or we can just refer to them as sphincters. So let me give you an example. Let's say you have these blood vessels that you see here are representing your blood vessels to your intestines, and they're supplying blood to your intestines. Now, let's say you are dealing with a situation such as a fight or flight response. When you are placed in a significant amount of pressure, you need to respond and you need to send a lot of blood directly to your skeletal muscle that enables you to, let's say, run away from a situation. So in this case, your body knows that it needs to divert blood from your stomach and intestines because they're not as necessary, and it needs to divert that blood directly to the skeletal muscle so your muscle can accomplish their task. So what happens is that the sphincters you see right here starts to close up. So blood does not get passed through the capillary network that you have here. What it's going to do is going to pass through the meta-arteriole and continue to become part of the vein, and this allows for the blood to basically be diverted from this tissue and go to the tissue such as the skeletal muscle that is in a dire need of more blood and more supply of oxygen and nutrients. So these are extremely essential. These sphincters are extremely important for basically making sure blood is moving in the right direction and it's distributed to the right region of the body depending on its need. Now, you will learn about this in more detail when we discuss blood-brain barrier in the nervous system, but this is just to kind of give you a hint. What you see here is at the center of this, you have your capillary network basically. You see your red blood cell passing through it. And what you see is you have these kind of, extensions, the blue extensions that are wrapped around the capillary bed, okay? These cells are referred to as astrocytes. Astrocytes. They are part of the cells or supporting cells of the nervous system, and they ensure that only certain molecules can pass from the capillary network and actually effectively reach the neurons. So astrocytes, basically think about them as guards that make sure nothing that is that can possibly harm your nervous system or cells of the nervous system cannot get out of the capillary and get access to the neuron or your nerve cells. Now, what you see here, this capillary network surrounded by astrocytes is referred to as the blood-brain barrier, because astrocytes are creating a barrier between nerve cells, as hence the word brain, and capillary network, which basically is your blood. Notice that you also have tight junctions that are separating these cells, they hold these cells together as another mean to make sure nothing actually leaks out from the gaps between your cells. These gaps are present. There is no tight junction in the normal capillary bed for the other tissues. I do want you also to understand that even though you have tight junctions and you have astrocytes, some of the molecules does pass through, including oxygen, carbon dioxide, and some of the anesthetics, which basically enables the person to go to unconsciousness when consume those medications. So I'm going to stop the PowerPoint here and we'll pick it up on your next presentation.